Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. I'm Mosavat, and I am currently a product manager, product lead at Slack. I run what we call our lifecycle team. At a lot of companies, we would call that growth, but we're effectively responsible for our self-service business, as well as product adoption for all segments, because most Slack adoption is started by people using Slack on their own in small teams. And I want to talk a little bit about that strategy, but also more broadly. I've had the pleasure of working at a bunch of different companies like Zynga, Runkeeper, Instacart, and Slack. And all of these companies, while they're very different, and Slack is actually my first ever B2B company, so I'm not really a B2B or SaaS expert. But all what these companies have in common is they all use either subscription business models, freemium, or some sort of like free-to-play, free business model as a big part of their strategy for growth. And so that's like one of the common through lines towards all the kinds of work that I've done to date over the past 8 to 9 years. So I want to talk a little bit about the lessons I've learned across these businesses. I wanted to just start with product market fit. So I think we've all heard of product market fit before. You're all here today because you've gotten there, because you understand that you have built a product that has gotten to some amount of scale and gotten past those initial days of a startup when things are not really working and you have to figure out what your product is. But I think now you have to start thinking about the next steps. And the next steps are that you're building a growth engine. You're building a real business, not just a product anymore, now that you've reached this stage. And I thought I was being really clever. I was imagining this concept. I had heard of product market fit. I'd heard of product channel fit, which I had heard coined by Brianne, who runs the Reforge program and is an excellent speaker on growth. I thought to myself, I'm going to talk about business model product fit. That's unique and interesting. That's really smart. Let me go get a slide on product market channel fit. Turns out, he already did it. So, great artist steal. So, this is a diagram that he put together, but my innovation, great artists steal with attribution. My innovation here is the diagonal arrow that I added in the middle there, talking about what kinds of products work with certain kinds of business models. And that's what I want to spend time on today. But to start, let's get some definitions together. I think freemium means a lot of things to a lot of people. We usually think about this continuum here between free forever, products that are ad supported, things like Facebook, or even like Slack, which you can use for free forever, or a call us business model. We often think of this as like self-service versus enterprise, but really there are a lot of dots in between this. There's usage limited type freemium, right? You can use up to 2 gigabytes on Dropbox, or a product like Envision where you have a certain number of seats or things like that. Beyond that is free trials, which people often call freemium as well. You don't have to put in a credit card. You can use a 30-day free trial. Past that, sort of moving even further away, you have free trials with a credit card, so you have to make some purchase commitment up front in order to use the product. There's self-service paid, so you can still like buy the thing, but you have to actually pay to use the product at all. And then there's a whole bunch of space before the call us sort of like pure enterprise model. And along this continuum, I think there's a couple of different ways to split it. The first is to think about products that are bought versus sold, right? So on the left, we usually call this self-service. There's things that are bought. And then sold is like, you have to like call and spend some time with somebody and someone either cold calls you, those kinds of things. There's different go-to-market strategies. And so I think of this often as like, are you selling to users or are you selling to choosers? Are you selling to the end users of your product or are you choosing to the people that make decisions for their company, software decision makers top down? And often these are, you can do both or only one of these. But I think the more interesting distinction, and the one I want to spend some time on today, is one that is also borrowed from my friend Christopher O'Donnell, who runs product at HubSpot, first introduced me to this concept of pools versus rivers. So a river is your traditional sales type, lead generation type model, but really free trials of all kinds, self-service paid, they're really business models that are like rivers. Things come floating down, they either get blocked and stuck on the rocks, or they keep flowing down that path and move to the next stage, right? And really you get a shot at a customer at each stage. Of course, there are times you can re-engage them, but you really think of this as a funnel type businesses. On the other hand, and I think this is what Slack is and what a lot of these more freemium type models are, even think Dropbox, think Figma, think Slack, these kinds of businesses are more like pools. You're building a pool of users who you are that are choosing to come out and to become paid customers at different times in their life cycle over time, and that there's a diversity of customers in that pool, and that pool is growing. And there are some interesting dynamics of that that I think are important and what I want to spend some time talking about today. So when I'm talking about freemium and the rest of this talk, I'm really talking about these pool type businesses. So what I want to just, if there's anything you get away from this talk, is really what does free work for me really has 5 aspects, I think, 5 key areas that need to work for a free business model to make sense to you. And I think it's important to note that these things are evolving over time, and you can't just make that decision at one moment in time in your product strategy. That great companies often evolve this over time depending on who their customers are, what their current business model is, what channels they're using, what are the different dynamics of those 4 boxes over time, right? So those 5 things are low-cost acquisition channels. Is there a quick activation path? Do you have internal growth loops? Is your core audience empowered to purchase? And is there a clear value metric? So I want to spend some time on each of those. So first, low-cost acquisition channels. There are exceptions to this rule, but I think, at least in my experience, paid marketing and freemium are like oil and water, especially in pure pool-type businesses where time to conversion can be very, very long. If you think about it, your conversion rates tend to be low in the single digits for free to paid. They oftentimes can be months and months before an acquired customer turns into a paid prospect, turns into a paid customer. Those kinds of things can often result in very high customer acquisition costs and lower LTVs, which makes sense even if the LTV of a paid customer is very, very high. Does that make sense? Like, you can burn a lot of cash trying to acquire customers, and even if the ROI is high, the payback periods may be too long. So I think you really do need to think about what is your acquisition engine, and does it fit a free business model? People often think that free is a way to acquire customers, but I think it's actually a way to capitalize on existing organic or cheap acquisition. So how will you build that acquisition? Is it going to be brand? Is it SEO? Is it your amazing Twitter presence? And is cross-organization virality built in the core use case of the product? There are these things like Dropbox is notorious, often talked about their early sharing flow, share a gigabyte of space, get a gigabyte of space. But really, I think the dynamics that today probably make Dropbox more valuable is share this file with someone at the marketing agency I work at, those kinds of flows. Without those kinds of cross-organization virality, it can be very, very hard to sustain a free business model over the long course of time, unless you have some other cheap acquisitions costs. So for Slack, that's brand. It's a big part of who we are. I think that's probably true for Drift as well. We have, strong virality built in. We have community teams that turn into locust hubs for other people to learn about Slack, like developer communities early on, those kinds of things that drove a lot of word of mouth and drove a lot of success for the product. So I think that's step 1. The second is low activation costs, and for this I like to use the analogy of sunglasses. So I forget things all the time. I lose them, I crush them, etc. And you'd think the right strategy for a person like me would be to buy cheap sunglasses because I lose them all the time. But you guys have all bought cheap sunglasses. You don't give a shit about them. You crush them, you break them, you lose them. And every time I buy a nice pair of Ray-Bans, I actually hold on to them for a lot longer. The irony of a free product is that customers value free things less. You think they'd use it more readily. You think that they'd be more interested in adopting your product. But often the fact that it's free means there's no upfront commitment. And so you really do need a large acquisition funnel in order to capitalize on this as a business model. Not only do they value free things less, you might just attract the wrong kinds of people. People who aren't that committed, people who are just heard about it and don't know what it is. And in a lot of ways, your marketing funnel is inverted. They've heard of your product before they know that they have a need for it. And so onboarding becomes super essential. You need to figure out a way to build this green curve versus the more traditional business to business or enterprise red curve for value versus time spent in the platform. So the way I think about it is great free products are able to get you to some value quickly, but long-term value over time. And the reason that is because, why are you free at all? You're free because the true value, the value that someone's willing to pay for, takes time to get to, but the trade-off you have to make is you need to get them to some value quickly. Versus say an HR, software like a work day. You get no value out of it until you put a ton of effort in to integrate it with all of your data and systems and processes, and then all of a sudden it's valuable. It doesn't make any sense for that to be a free product. It's not going to get anybody anywhere. And so again, this is where like not just the business model, but the types of customers you're approaching and their needs are a super important part of deciding what kinds of business, whether free is a good model for you. Next is internal growth loops. So here I'm using the example of Dropbox Paper. I don't know how many of you have ever used it, but one of the biggest reasons to use a free model is because you don't want to block adoption inside of an organization. Once you land a single person, does that product naturally grow inside of that organization? So think about like the create a document, share with collaborators, comment on it, get mentions, come back, create new documents loop that Dropbox Paper has. That's a paid product, but it could, if they were launching from scratch, a Notion or a note product or a wiki type product, it can be really valuable for that to be free so that you create as much content as possible and create value over time because there are more people collaborating. Blocking I think this is the most powerful reason to have a free version or some free access to your product, because you don't want to get in the way of these collaborative loops, and often you need some collaboration for the product to have value. So think of Slack, for instance. It's useless by yourself. If you charged per seat immediately, it's highly unlikely you would invite 5 people immediately, right? The next one is empowered to purchase. So I think this one's really important and one that's often missed. Do you have users? Again, yeah, if your users are the buyers, they need to be empowered to make business decisions. Often this is why self-service businesses target small businesses. Small businesses, it's usually an owner signing up and doing it. They have a credit card or they have the ability to decide what kinds of decisions they want to make for their business. But if you're trying to target like groups within an enterprise or groups within that are not just small businesses, is that group of people empowered to make their own buying decisions? These days, developers are. That probably wasn't the case 10 years ago, but I think a lot has changed now that engineering organizations can decide what kinds of tools they want to buy for themselves. Or if they can't, are they willing to pay out of pocket? So I think sales teams, for instance, is a great example of this. You get paid for success, so of course you're going to pay for a tool if it's valuable to you. But I think that this is an important thing that a lot of people miss. If your users aren't empowered to purchase or don't have some incentive to buy, that's probably not a good fit for your business. Self-serve in general is probably not a good fit, and free-to-paid conversion is probably not a good fit. Small businesses can be a great cheat for this, but they are problematic at scale. A lot of businesses have to abandon that in the long run because it's very, very difficult to acquire enough customers to get to hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. The next one is a clear value metric. This was a mistake we made at Runkeeper that I think has really sunk with me since, which is that premium features are really hard to anchor a free-to-paid conversion moment on. And the reason for that is that different features are valuable to different kinds of people, right? So for instance, we thought early on at Runkeeper that having data, you're building up data, we don't want to get in the way, you get a bunch of data, you run a bunch of times, you have all this cool trend stuff, and so we'll sell like advanced analytics on that. Turns out only a small percentage of your total user base is interested in that. So you end up in this situation where only certain personas or certain types or subgroups of your customers are willing to pay. And I think that there's that you're much better off with some sort of clear value metric that's widely valuable to your customers that you can anchor payment on. So for Slack, that's messages. How many messages are there in your archive? The length of your archive isn't often one. Dropbox has, gigabytes of storage. You have to have something that's universally valuable to most of the people using your product, and that value builds over time. Now, the tricky thing is, and I'll talk about this more later, is can you find a threshold that doesn't hurt early usage? Because there's this trade-off between allowing early adoption and having enough value in that metric to drive conversion. So some warning signs. The biggest one, this one is one of the biggest, I think, problems that companies like this run into is what I would call the value gap. In a normal product, you go to the store and you buy a bottle of Tide. There's some value that it provides to you that you value at some level, and there's some cost. And the gap in between is called the incentive to buy. This is where you make money, right? Hopefully it costs you less to create this than you can sell it for, and there's some gap between the value to the customer and the cost of the customer. I mean, that's their incentive to purchase your product. But in free products, you have a new dynamic, which is that the cost to the customer in their mind is not the value of the product you sell holistically. It's the value of the product incremental to the free product that you've given them. And so what you can end up with is a value gap. And this value gap is really problematic because you could have competitors who are charging more for a non-freemium product and selling more than you are. And this is a dynamic that can be very difficult. The problem here is you are building a trade-off between that green adoption curve and your long-term monetization. And getting that right is really, really hard. You can solve this value gap in two ways, one of which is very painful, which is to reduce the value of the free product, and the other, which is very, very hard, which is increase the value to the customer by adding more premium features or other kinds of limits or other things that drive there. And those dynamics are very hard to get right. And often companies fail not because they don't provide a good product, but because the value of the paid product is not enough incremental to support the business. This is a problem I've run into many, many times across many products, and it can be very, very problematic. The next one is paid feature overload. When you think about products, so I'm trying to solve this problem. So what do? I add more paid features. How do I make sure people know about them? I add lots of call outs all over my free product in order to try and convert different kinds of customers who care about different things. The best example I could come up with on this was LinkedIn, which I feel like tells me I should pay for premium every 5 seconds. And there are hundreds of different reasons to convert to paid on LinkedIn. There's not like, because they have so many different kinds of customers using it for free with so many different kinds of needs, it's very difficult for them to identify and target the right customers at the right time. So what do? You run an A/B test. You throw up a new pay for this button. People click on it. It drives incremental purchases. And someday you end up, and I know I've talked to some folks at HubSpot and other companies, you come back a year and a half later and you're like, fuck, there's 150 of these things all over, and then you end up with a pricing page and nobody can understand. This is like a very, very common anti-pattern for freemium products over time. The last one is that it takes patience and it takes money. If you want to support a pool of free users that hopefully will grow and grow and grow over time, you need to be patient and you need to have a lot of usually funding in order to pay for that, because you may be acquiring customers. Even organic acquisition costs money. You have to build a big team to do that activation work and onboarding work that I talked about. You have to have a bigger R&D budget because you need to be constantly thinking about customer needs as they evolve over time. You need to support these customers with AWS costs and other things like that over time, and you need to have the time and money to be able to do this. And the last one is, I think a lot of people think that if they build a self-service business, they don't ever need a sales team. But it turns out that there are always whales. If you do this really, really well, you're gonna have some 5-person developer team inside of a large company using your product, and guess what? They might buy your product with a credit card, they might try to sneak past their boss, they might try to expense it, but in the long run, you can't it's very, very hard to have meaningful adoption in the enterprise without a sales team. It's an inevitability, and now you're presented with a choice. Do you keep your self-service business? Is it a lead generation engine? Is it a real line of business for you? Or are you going to move to the enterprise? And I think this is a question that almost every SaaS company has to approach at some point in their life cycle, probably right around where you guys are. I've already talked to somebody today on this. The fact is that these kinds of free business models don't always last forever. And so you have to constantly reevaluate. These things are not always true. Think about the classic, user adoption curve, early adopters, late majority, et cetera. If you're doing a good job and you're growing organically, the kinds of customers you're getting are gonna be changing over time. Their needs are gonna change, and their time to value is gonna change. Their activation path is gonna be different. Internal growth loops may or may no longer be as valuable because you have different kinds of customers who have different needs. Your value metrics may not apply anymore. Those people may not be empowered to purchase. So you have to constantly reevaluate these. And this is why you see a lot of companies change their business models over time. I think it's very, very dangerous if you say, this is the way we are, this is what we do, this is the business we sell. And a year later find yourself in a position where you're like, no one's converting to pay. Why do I have cohort decay? Why do I see my conversion rate declining over time? So I think the most important thing is to be constantly reevaluating these things. That's why growth teams, for instance, people ask me all the time, once you get a good onboarding, what does that team do? And it turns out if you get a good onboarding and you're growing, your customers are changing, so the onboarding you need is changing. You should be constantly evolving, constantly learning for your customers. And I think that this is an important piece. If you're building any kind of self-service or freemium business, you need to constantly keep an eye on the fact that the world is changing out from underneath you. This is not a consistent system that you're layering on top of. And so how do you always reevaluate against these 5 criteria and think about whether that business model is right for you anymore? So that's all I have. I nailed it, 131. So if you're interested, follow me on Twitter. That's it. Questions?